The road stretched like an unwinding thread of memory, lined with tired trees and forgotten motels. Marcus Landon had been driving for nearly 8 hours, not because he had to, but because there was no other way he could bring himself to fly. Planes were too fast, too easy, too detached. He needed to feel every mile, every silence, every weight of the past pressing on the wheel. In the passenger seat lay a carefully folded marine dress uniform, the deep blue coat, brass buttons polished until they caught even the dull morning light, crimson trim still sharp from decades past. A silent relic of wars nobody asked about anymore. He hadn't worn it in over 15 years, not since the funeral of his wife, Maya. That day, he had stood the same way he had in combat, still, composed, letting the storm rage inside while the world only saw a statue of discipline. Today, he would wear it again.
It wasn't vanity.
It was a nostalgia.
It was a vow.
His son, Jalen, was graduating. The first Landon in 3 generations to walk that stage with a diploma in hand. No war, no jail, no early grave. Just a future. Marcus had missed too many firsts, the first football game, the first heartbreak, even the first "Dad, I made it." He wouldn't miss this. No matter how many hours he had to drive or how many old wounds the uniform might reopen. As the town sign of Elkhart, Texas came into view, Marcus could feel the temperature rise, the air thicken with that southern mix of dust, diesel, and pride. He found a quiet diner at the edge of town, cleaned up in the restroom, and slipped into the uniform with the slow care of ritual. Every button was a memory, every crease a name, every thread a sacrifice. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he barely recognized the man. The skin was darker now, worn from years under sun and time. The eyes were deeper,
calmer.
But the man inside, the one who had walked through hell, held bleeding friends, stood under mortar fire, and never once flinched, he was still there. Marcus arrived at the school gymnasium an hour early. He parked far away, out of habit, where no one would notice him. The walk across the parking lot felt heavier than the desert packs he used to carry. Not because of age, but because of what he carried in his chest. A photograph of his wife holding a newborn Jalen, tucked in the inside pocket of his jacket like a talisman. No one greeted him at the door. No one asked who he was. Just another black man in a military uniform, walking alone into a sea of folding chairs and nervous parents. He found his seat in the front row, the one marked, reserved for graduating families. He sat, upright and silent, hands resting calmly on his knees, like he used to during debriefings. Around him, people chatted, laughed, texted. A few eyes glanced his way, then quickly turned away, unsure of what to make of him. Marcus didn't notice. Or perhaps he didn't care. He had come to see his son walk across that stage. Not to be noticed. Not to explain himself. Not to be thanked. Just to witness. Quietly. Fully. With the same dignity that had kept him alive all these years. The ticket was creased but clean, printed from an email Marcus didn't know how to open without help from the library clerk back in Oklahoma. Jalen had sent it a month ago, a digital invitation to his high school graduation, along with a short, almost hesitant message. "Would be good to see you if you can make it. I understand if not." Marcus had read that line at least 20 times before printing the ticket. Not because he didn't understand the words, but because he felt every wound they didn't say. He approached the gymnasium checkpoint slowly, uniform pressed, hands steady, eyes forward. A young woman with a clipboard and headset greeted the long line of family members with mechanical cheer. She glanced at his printed ticket, paused for a beat too long, then tapped her earpiece and whispered something Marcus couldn't hear. Her eyes flicked up at him, then down again, and she forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm sorry, sir. It looks like this ticket isn't in the system." Marcus blinked. "I printed it from the school's website," he said quietly, his voice rough like gravel and restraint. "Yes, but the barcodes were updated last week. This version isn't scannable anymore. I'm really sorry. We've had to turn away a few people today." He nodded slowly, more to himself than to her. She didn't know he'd driven 8 hours. She didn't know that he hadn't been able to call Jalen without risking a cold silence or worse, no answer. She didn't know what it cost a man like him to ask for help in the first place. "I'm his father," Marcus said, not defiantly, not proudly, just like a man stating the weather. Her smile faltered, just a flicker. She looked down at the list. Name: Marcus Landon. She scanned the clipboard. Her silence was answer enough. "I'm really sorry, sir. The fire marshal's been strict. Capacity issues. We have to follow protocol." Marcus stepped back, nodding once. The silence he carried didn't break. He looked down at the paper in his hand, folded it carefully, and placed it back into the inside pocket of his uniform, beside the photo of his wife and newborn son. He didn't argue. He didn't ask for a manager. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, he walked out slowly, past the waiting families, the balloons, the laughter, the selfie sticks, and proud aunts in their Sunday best. He walked past all of it, his boots clicking against the gym's concrete floor like distant echoes from a life no one there had ever lived. Outside, the sun had begun to set. The air was warmer now, filled with the soft music of cicadas and car engines humming an idyll. He stood in the parking lot alone, looking at the entrance like a man looking at a closed door he'd once kicked open for others. Then he spotted an old janitor's access door propped open around the side, where a few students were slipping in unnoticed, laughing, skipping the line. Marcus didn't follow. He walked to the edge of the lot, found a shaded bench under a dying sycamore tree, and sat. He could still hear the muffled applause from inside. He closed his eyes and listened. Every name called, every cheer that echoed beyond the walls, he filtered them, waiting for one. And then it came. Jalen Landon. The crowd erupted. Marcus didn't smile. He didn't cry. But something in his shoulders dropped, not in defeat, but in the quiet relief of a man who had lived long enough to see a promise fulfilled, even if from the shadows. He sat there until the ceremony ended, until the sun slipped below the horizon and the families began pouring out, embracing, posing for photos. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. He had seen what he came to see. When Jalen walked out, grinning in his cap and gown, surrounded by friends, Marcus simply watched from a distance. Then he stood, adjusted the jacket of his uniform, turned toward his car, and walked away with the same calm silence he had carried into every battlefield he'd ever survived. The next morning, Marcus stood in line at the bank. It was a small, glass-walled branch on the corner of a quiet street, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of carpet cleaner and printer toner lingering in the air. He held a folded government-issued check in one hand, the edge slightly frayed from being handled too many times. The teller behind the glass was young, her nails painted blue, her smile clipped and polite. When it was finally his turn, he stepped forward and placed the check on the counter with the same deliberate motion he'd once used to place classified intel on a commanding officer's desk. She took one look and paused. Her brows lifted, a quick, involuntary signal that something didn't add up. "One moment, sir." She vanished behind the partition with the check in hand. He waited, standing straight, boots square, hands clasped loosely behind his back. The people behind him in line shifted impatiently. A child cried. A woman's voice rose in frustration at a malfunctioning ATM. Marcus didn't move. He had waited in jungles, in deserts, in hospital hallways, in cemeteries. He could wait here, too. When the teller returned, her tone had changed, not impolite, but tight around the edges. "Sir, I'm going to need to verify this. We don't see many of these types of checks. Do you have a letter of explanation? Identification? A contact number for the issuing office?" "It's a Department of Defense reparation," Marcus replied calmly. "Retroactive. I was told this branch could process it." She nodded, but her expression stayed guarded. "It's just unusual. The amount. The format. We have protocols for potential fraud." He didn't flinch. He didn't frown. He reached into his jacket and handed over his military ID, now worn and slightly faded, the edges curled. She held it like it might disintegrate in her hands. Her eyes scanned it, then him, then it again. You served? She asked. He gave a short nod. Her voice lowered slightly. I'm just doing my job, sir. So did I, he replied, gently but without apology. There was no anger in his voice, no need for volume. His dignity didn't rise or fall on whether this young woman believed him. It had been earned long before today, in years of unspoken sacrifice, in every scar he didn't show, in every man he had buried and saluted and left behind. She stepped away again, and this time a manager appeared, a man in a blazer too clean, voice too loud. He looked at the check, then at Marcus, and something unspoken passed between them. Not recognition exactly, but awareness. The manager nodded, whispered something to the teller, and disappeared again. The transaction was processed. Quietly. No apology was offered. None was asked for. As she handed him the receipt, the teller finally looked him in the eye, as if seeing him for the first time. Not just the uniform, not the check, but the man. A man who hadn't asked for sympathy, or gratitude, or explanation. He thanked her with a nod, and turned to leave. The door closed behind him with a soft click, muting the low murmur of financial transactions and fluorescent indifference. Outside, the day was clear and still. He tucked the receipt into the same pocket where the folded graduation ticket still rested, warm now from the sun and from his skin. Marcus walked slowly back to his car, not because he was tired, but because every step was deliberate. He was not a man in a hurry. He had been shaped by time and silence and things that no civilian counter or skeptical glance could undo. And he didn't need anyone to believe him. His life was not a story waiting to be approved. His worth was not waiting behind glass. His dignity had never needed a microphone, a podium, or proof. It had been forged in the quiet, and in the quiet, it remained unshakable. The sun was beginning to slip behind the trees when Marcus pulled up to the curb outside the community college. He didn't get out. He just sat there for a moment, fingers resting on the steering wheel, watching the students drift in and out of the building like leaves caught in a gentle wind. Laughter floated in the air, mixed with the sound of car doors slamming and sneakers scraping against the sidewalk. It was a good kind of noise, the kind that belonged to a life untouched by certain things.
War.
Regret. Waiting rooms with bad coffee and worse news. Inside his pocket, the graduation ticket still waited. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Not to the woman at the bank. Not to the clerk at the gas station who had looked too long at his uniform. Not even to his son, whose name was printed in clean black ink on that small square of paper.
To Dad, it had said.
That was all. No apology. No explanation. Just 3 words. Enough to cross oceans. Or not. Marcus thought about turning the key again, about driving away before the lights in the auditorium came on. But then, slowly, the sound of boots on gravel began to echo in his memory. No, not in memory. In real time. They came without fanfare. One by one. From side streets, from parked cars, from shaded corners where people don't look twice. Not in formation, not in uniform, but with the unmistakable quiet of men who had once waited for nightfall before moving. Broad shoulders. Heavy silence. Eyes that scanned more than they stared. One wore a baseball cap, pulled low. Another had a limp he didn't try to hide. One of them walked with a dog whose harness read service animal, do not pet. And they all walked toward him.
No one had called them.
No text message had gone out. No code red. No brotherhood hotline. But they came anyway. Because word travels differently among those who've bled together. Because somewhere, someone had seen Marcus walk into that bank and not be believed. Someone had recognized the look, not humiliation, but restraint. The way a man tightens his jaw not because he's afraid, but because he refuses to let rage speak for him. That kind of silence echoes. And those echoes reached far. The first man to approach nodded without a smile. You going in? Marcus looked at him. Then at the others now standing behind. Not in a line, not like a formation, but like a wall. I wasn't sure, he said, voice low. The man shrugged. Well, we are. And that was it. They didn't ask what the ticket said. They didn't need to know how many birthdays he had missed, or why his son hadn't answered his last voicemail. They didn't want the story. They were the story, the part that shows up when the lights are low and the doubts are loud. They stood for the part of you that remembers your worth even when the world forgets your name. Marcus got out of the car. Together, without words, they crossed the lot. The college building ahead glowed with soft light. Families posed for photos at the doors. Students hugged. Faculty members in robes checked clipboards and smiled for pictures. And then, into that warmth, into that joy, stepped a group of men whose celebration was not loud, but profound. No medals on their chests,
Just gravity in their step.
as they walked in, people parted without knowing why. It wasn't fear. It wasn't reverence. It was recognition, the subtle shift in atmosphere when men carry something invisible but immense. Inside, the graduation ceremony had just begun. Names were being called. Applause rose and fell in steady waves. Marcus stood at the back with his brothers behind him, not hidden, but not demanding to be seen either. When his son's name was announced, Marcus didn't clap.
He didn't need to.
Because his pride was not performative. It was silent.
Steady.
Earned. His brothers stayed with him until the lights came up. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, they began to drift away again. One toward a waiting car, another into a shadowed alley, one pausing to whisper something to a janitor on his way home. No promises were exchanged. No plans were made. But before the last man left, he turned back to Marcus, offered him a firm nod, and said, "We saw you." And in that one sentence was the kind of validation that no award, no bank receipt, no handshake from a stranger could ever offer. They had stepped out of the shadows, not to save him, but to remind him that he had never been alone there. The auditorium had emptied slowly, like a tide pulling back at dusk. Laughter still echoed faintly in the corners, mingled with the rustling of folding chairs and the distant squeak of janitors' carts. Marcus remained in his seat at the back, unmoved, as if carved into the shadowed wall. His cap rested on his knee, his boots still dusty from the long walk in, his eyes fixed on the stage where his son had stood. They had not spoken. Not before, not after. Ethan had walked across the stage with steady steps, collected his diploma, smiled for the camera, and exited through the far side like every other graduate. There was no searching of the crowd. No pause to scan the back rows for a face that might have once tucked him in with stories about helicopters and sandstorms and constellations named after old war buddies. If he had seen Marcus at all, he gave no sign. But Marcus had seen him, not just with the eyes of a father, but with the eyes of a soldier who had spent a lifetime reading silences louder than gunfire. There had been no applause. Not for Marcus. Not from the men who had stood behind him like an unspoken testimony. They didn't clap because they weren't here for celebration. They were here for witness. Because sometimes silence is the only honest sound left in the room. Outside, night had fallen, soft and unapologetic. The men had gone. One by one, they had returned to their quiet lives, the mechanic shop, the farm on the edge of town, the VA hospital room with the broken TV. They didn't ask for thanks. They didn't leave numbers. They never would. Marcus walked alone across the now empty parking lot, his footsteps echoing faintly beneath the hum of overhead lights. A cool breeze swept through, and with it came the distant sound of a trumpet somewhere far off, probably a student practicing, or maybe not. Maybe just the wind playing tricks on an old man's ears. He reached his truck, opened the door, and slid inside. For a long moment, he just sat there, the graduation ticket still in his pocket, the uniform still clinging to the smell of old sweat and memory. He hadn't come expecting closure. Closure was a civilian word. He had come because dignity isn't something you demand. It's something you demonstrate. Quietly. Repeatedly. Even when no one is watching. Especially when the people who should see you most have chosen not to. The balance of silence is not passive. It's an active choice. To bear the weight of pride and grief without letting either crush the other. To show up not for a reaction, but for a reason. To hold your ground even when the ones you love walk away from it. As he started the engine, the headlights lit up the concrete in front of him, revealing nothing new. Just a path home. Just another long road, like so many others he had traveled, some lined with palm trees, others with gunfire. But tonight's road was different. Not because it led to a warm welcome, it wouldn't. Not because it ended in reunion, it didn't. But because he had come. He had stood. He had stayed. And in doing so, he had shifted something invisible, not in Ethan, perhaps not yet, but in the air around them. Like the faint adjustment of a scale that no one sees but everyone eventually feels. Because the silence of a father who has nothing to prove, and yet still shows up, weighs more than 1,000 apologies never spoken. And somewhere, even if only in the deep recesses of memory or in the stillness of a dream Ethan hadn't had yet, that silence would echo. Long after the applause had faded. The sun rose gently the next morning, spilling its light over the quiet town like a slow exhale. The high school's banners still fluttered from the ceremony the night before, their edges now curled with dew and the weight of meaning. Balloons lay deflated on the grass. The applause was gone. So were the speeches, the hashtags, the perfectly filtered photos. But something had stayed behind, something that didn't belong to any one person but to all of them. In a town that had forgotten how to remember, yesterday had not been about Ethan. It had been about Marcus. About the brothers who stood behind him. And about the generation who never had a stage to walk across, but carried the world anyway. Because there are graduations no diploma can capture. No principal can announce. No mother can cry through clutching tissues and camcorders. There are ceremonies that happen in silence, earned not by papers, but by pain, by restraint, by honor stitched into skin like shrapnel that never worked its way out. The real graduation happened the moment Marcus stepped off school grounds and paused by the fence, where one of the janitors was sweeping up confetti with a slow, patient rhythm. The old man glanced at him, not with pity, but recognition. And in that brief nod, an acknowledgement passed. We saw you. Even if they didn't, we did. Marcus didn't nod back. He just kept walking. But something was different now. Not in the world. They would still forget him. The newspapers would still print nothing. The bank teller who had once looked at his torn uniform with suspicion wouldn't change overnight. Ethan would still keep his distance, maybe for years, maybe forever. But the invisible ledger that kept track of dignity, somewhere in the quiet places of the country's soul, it had a new line etched into it now. Because what the crowd had witnessed last night wasn't just a boy graduating. It was a generation standing up. Not with protest signs or angry speeches or medals held aloft, but in boots that had walked deserts no one asked about. In hands that had carried bodies no one claimed. In eyes that had seen both horror and beauty and still chose restraint over vengeance. They had not come to be seen. But by being there, they made it impossible to unsee them. The truth is, Marcus and the others had graduated long ago. From the barracks, where they became men. From the firefights, where they became shadows. From the VA waiting rooms, where they became ghosts. Last night was not their graduation, but it was, in a way, their vindication. Because even in a world that no longer calls their names, there are moments when the fabric of silence tears just enough to let memory breathe. And in that breath, the story of a generation is spoken. Not in words, but in presence. Marcus didn't keep the program. Didn't save the photo from the school's website. Didn't tell anyone he'd gone. But somewhere deep inside the halls of that school, the floor still held the weight of his boots. The air still remembered the silence of his salute. And the town, whether it understood or not, had just been part of a graduation it didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Because when one man stands with dignity, a boy may one day grow into it. And when a generation walks through fire without asking for thanks, the least the world can do is remember their steps. The last thing the wind carried away from the schoolyard that morning was not a banner, not a cap, not a leftover echo of music. It was the memory of men who stood without a stage and graduated in silence.